Hello everyone, I'm Nick Fortin, Deer and Moose Project Leader for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. In this presentation, I'm going to cover the current status of moose in Vermont, as well as the science and reasoning behind the department's 2023 moose harvest recommendation. Before we get into the 2023 recommendation, I want to quickly touch on the results from last fall's moose hunting seasons. In 2022, we issued 100 moose hunting permits, all in WMU E, and hunters ended up harvesting a total of 51 moose. 11 moose were taken during the archery season, which was the highest success rate ever for that season. In contrast, 40 moose were taken during the regular season, which was among the lowest success rates ever for that season, particularly for either sex permits. Now, we believe the low success rates during the regular season were due to limited moose activity early in the season, likely due to warm weather, possibly other factors. Only 2 moose were taken on opening day, which was the lowest opening day success ever. On the other hand, the last day of the season had the highest ever daily success rate on that particular day. The 2022 Moose Harvest Report with additional details is available on our website. Moose population objectives in Vermont have been set in the department's 2020 to 2030 Big Game Management Plan. Most of moose range in Vermont has a density objective of 0.5 moose per square mile. Now, the department has begun assessing moose habitat across the state, and we'll be evaluating whether those are still appropriate objectives and how many moose we should realistically expect to have in each area given current and future habitat conditions. But for now, these remain our objectives. WMU's E1, E2, and D2 in the northeast corner of the state have a higher density objective of about 1 moose per square mile. That is reflective of better habitat in those areas and historically higher moose densities, but also considers what we know about moose density and the impacts of winter ticks. Ultimately, our goal is to have a healthy and sustainable moose population, and we believe these density objectives will allow us to achieve that goal. When we look at our current moose density estimates for each WMU relative to those population objectives, we see that in most of Vermont, populations are not only below objectives, but also below our established moose hunting thresholds. In this figure, the green bars are our current moose density estimate, the blue lines are the density objective, and the orange lines are the hunting threshold for each WMU. Now, those hunting thresholds, which were also set in the big game plan, are at 75% of the moose density objective for each WMU. As long as populations remain below that hunting threshold, we will not be issuing moose hunting permits in those areas. However, as you can see, WMU's E1 and E2, the current density is well above the objective of 1 moose per square mile, and so that is the only area we are recommending moose hunting permits, and that is the area we will be focusing on for most of this presentation. If we plot this on a map, where each dot here represents one estimated moose in the underlying wildlife management unit, we can clearly see that the density of moose in WMU E, in the northeast corner of the state, is much higher than the rest of Vermont. In fact, based on current estimates, and despite being only 7% of the land area of the state, there are as many moose in WMU E as there are in the rest of Vermont combined. And there are a couple reasons why moose densities are lower across most of Vermont. One reason is the prevalence of brainworm. Brainworm is a parasite that is commonly carried by white-tailed deer. It has an interesting life cycle that requires a snail or a slug as an intermediate host. But because deer evolved with this parasite, it causes them no harm. But if a moose contracts brainworm, the result is often fatal neurological disease. So, as you would then expect, brainworm is more common in areas with more deer, and most of Vermont probably has enough deer that brainworm is common enough that it kills enough moose to limit the size of the moose population. The other major reason that most of Vermont supports fewer moose is the lack of young forest habitat. Moose are large animals that eat almost exclusively browse, or the leaves and twigs of woody vegetation. Areas of young forest, like the photo on the left, provide a lot of food for moose, and they have a significant influence on how many moose an area can support. However, most forests in Vermont look more like the photo on the right. They're relatively mature and even aged, and they provide very little food or cover for moose. The exception to this is the northeast corner of the state, which I'll touch on shortly, as it will be the focus of the remainder of this presentation. So just to make this clear before we move on, the focus of the rest of this presentation and the focus of our 2023 moose harvest recommendation is on WMU E in the northeast corner of the state, not the rest of Vermont. We are not recommending moose hunting permits anywhere outside of WMU E. Much of what is discussed in the harvest recommendation and what I'll focus on here is not necessarily relevant to the rest of Vermont. As I've just touched on, there are different factors affecting moose in those areas than in WMU E. WMU E is part of a larger area of moose core range in New England that extends through northern New Hampshire and western and northern Maine. This area supports much higher densities of moose than the rest of New England for several reasons. First, it has a colder climate with longer winters, which is beneficial for a northern species near the southern edge of its range. Those longer winters also limit deer numbers, which helps reduce the incidence of brainworm. But perhaps most importantly, this area is dominated by commercial timberlands. The extensive and intensive logging activity associated with those lands creates a lot of young forest habitat, which provides a lot of food for moose. This abundance of food is a major reason these areas support much higher densities of moose than other parts of the region. Here's some quick history and perspective on moose numbers in WMU E. In the early 2000s, moose numbers were very high. They were causing significant damage to their habitat, and that was causing their health to decline. Because of that, our department issued very high numbers of permits in this area to intentionally reduce moose numbers. The last year of those high permit allocations was 2010. And since 2011 or maybe 2012, the population has remained relatively stable at around 1.5 moose per square mile. So yes, there are fewer moose than there were 15 or 20 years ago, but the moose population in this area is not declining. Another really important thing to point out here that I think is often lost is that the current density of moose here in WMU E, again, roughly 1.5 moose per square mile, is still a very high density of moose. Now, this can be difficult for people to understand because one is a small number. So when you say 1 to 2 moose per square mile, that does not intuitively sound like a lot of moose, but it is. The other thing that makes this difficult is that most of us can remember a time in the not too distant past when we had more moose. But that does not negate the fact that we still have a very high density moose population. For some perspective, moose only occur at densities of 1 moose per square mile or greater in about 7% of their entire range in North America. So we need to recognize that even though we had more moose in the past, we still have a high density moose population in WMU E. And that high density brings us to the winter tick. So winter tick is one of 14 species of tick found in Vermont. These are not the deer ticks or dog ticks that people might come in contact with. They're a different species of tick. Unlike those ticks that people are more familiar with, which have been expanding their range in Vermont, winter ticks have been here for a long time, possibly as long as we've had moose. And because of the impact they can have on moose, they're sometimes called a moose tick. And the major reason they can have such an impact on moose, and what makes them really unique among ticks, is their life cycle. Most species of tick, including the deer ticks and dog ticks that people are familiar with, are three-host ticks. That means they feed on a different individual animal during each of their three life stages: larva, nymph, and adult. They might be on a host animal for a couple days, but after taking a blood meal, they drop off to molt into their next life stage or to lay eggs. This multiple host strategy is why those ticks spread diseases. But winter ticks are different. They are a single host tick, which means they complete all three life stages on the same individual host animal. Winter ticks find a host in the fall and spend the entire winter on that same animal before taking their final blood meal and dropping off in the early spring to lay eggs. And there are two main reasons why this life cycle is problematic for moose. First, the timing is such that the peak questing period, or when those larval ticks are on vegetation waiting for a host to walk by in the fall, coincides with the rut or mating season for moose. So moose are more active during that time searching for a mate, and as a result, they pick up more ticks. And winter ticks aren't picked up one or two at a time. They quest in larval clusters that can contain hundreds or thousands of larval ticks. So over the course of the fall, a moose only needs to pick up a few dozen of these clusters to end up carrying tens of thousands of ticks. And that brings us to the second reason, and the reason winter ticks affect moose more than other large mammals. Moose are poor groomers. Moose evolved in northern areas without external parasites like ticks, and as a result, they do not habitually groom themselves like most other mammals. Winter ticks must spend 5 to 6 months on the same animal during the winter. Any animal that regularly grooms itself will remove most of the ticks during that time, and since it's winter, those ticks will die. By the time moose notice the ticks, because they're causing enough irritation, they're carrying tens of thousands of them, most of them are adults and well attached, and it's too late. Some moose, like this one, will rub much of their hair off at that point, but that does little to remove ticks, and of course it has other consequences since it's still winter and the moose needs that insulating hair. So because moose carry so many more ticks than other animals, the abundance or density of moose on the landscape has a significant influence on the abundance of winter ticks. To further illustrate why high moose densities result in high winter tick densities, let's consider this example. So keep in mind that questing winter tick larvae aren't out there chasing after moose. They're only able to move a few feet, essentially up and down vegetation, and so they rely on a moose or another host to walk by and pick them up. So if there are more moose on the landscape, the likelihood of those larvae being picked up by a passing moose is much greater. And with more moose, more larvae get picked up, and the greater number of moose collectively pick up a greater number of ticks. And so there are more ticks to drop off in the spring and lay eggs and start the cycle all over again. Conversely, at lower moose densities, fewer of those questing larval ticks in the fall are going to be able to find a host, and the lower number of moose are going to collectively pick up a lower number of ticks, and therefore fewer adult ticks will be dropped off in the spring. Now, in this scenario, we start with the same number of questing larvae in the fall, but if we were to play this out another year, there would be fewer questing larvae the following fall, and going forward, moose would pick up fewer ticks each year. We know a lot about the relationship between moose and winter ticks because of recent and ongoing research conducted here in Vermont and across the Northeast. So working with the University of Vermont from 2017 to 2019, we captured and collared 126 moose in WMU E. That included 36 adult cows and 90 calf moose. This allowed us to monitor health, survival, and reproductive rates in these moose. And what we found through this work was that adult survival remained fairly good. However, those cows were debilitated by winter ticks, which caused them to produce fewer calves, and those calves had low survival rates through the summer. And in the winter, about half of the calves that we collared in January, at about 8 months old, died before May, primarily due to heavy winter tick loads. And while we learned and are continuing to learn a lot from this effort, it is important to note here that we are not alone. Our project was conducted concurrently with similar efforts in New Hampshire and Maine. Collectively, these efforts spanned 6 years, collared more than 700 moose, and encompassed a range of moose densities and climate conditions within that core moose range in New England. This has provided a bigger picture than what we found here in Vermont, and significantly improved our understanding of the relationship between moose and winter ticks in this region. Ongoing efforts across the Northeast are helping us to further understand this complex relationship. As I mentioned earlier, our overarching management goal for moose is to have a healthy and sustainable moose population. We want to have big, fat, healthy cows that produce a lot of big, fat, healthy calves that are going to survive and be more resilient to whatever stressors might come their way, whether that's winter ticks or some other parasite or something we're not even aware of right now. We don't want small, unhealthy cows that produce fewer and smaller calves that have less chance of surviving and are less resilient to the impacts of winter ticks or any other stressors. And most importantly, we don't want half of our calves to die each year from heavy winter tick infestations. Having fewer, healthier moose will make our moose population more sustainable and more resilient to the many stresses that moose are going to face, particularly as our climate continues to warm. And the data we have indicates that our moose continue to be unhealthy. So this figure shows the ovulation rate of mature cow moose in WMU E over time. Essentially, this is the number of calves the cow would give birth to in the following spring. And these data come from ovaries collected from harvested moose. Ideally, in a healthy moose population, we'd like to see reproductive rates around 1.2 calves per mature cow. And that's where we were until the early 2000s when moose were overabundant and damaging their habitat, which caused their health and reproductive rates to decline. But despite fewer moose and improved habitat quality, health remains poor and reproductive rates remain low because of the impacts of winter ticks. So data from the past couple years indicate we might, emphasis on might, be starting to see some improvement, but it is too early to know if that is real or if it would be sustainable. So we know moose health is currently poor, and the primary reason for that is the abundance of winter ticks. In order to improve moose health, we need to reduce the abundance of winter ticks, and the only way to do that is to reduce the abundance of moose in WMU E. Now, because we know many of you are having this thought, it's worth mentioning here that there is currently no way to manage winter ticks directly. There is no feasible or practical way to treat enough moose or enough of the landscape to control winter ticks. We are supporting ongoing research at UVM looking at the use of fungal pathogens to control winter ticks, and that has been successful in the lab, but its effectiveness in the field has not been tested yet. It may one day be a useful tool for small areas, but it is unlikely that it will ever be practical over large areas like an entire wildlife management unit. And even if it was, we would need to seriously consider whether applying a pesticide broadly across an entire landscape is an appropriate management option. More importantly, this approach does not address the cause of the problem, which is too many moose. Whenever treatments stop or ticks inevitably develop immunity to it, tick numbers would simply increase again because of the high density of moose. We may not like ticks, but remember that ticks have probably been here as long as moose have. Winter ticks have probably been here as long as moose have. We need to focus on finding the right balance between the two. The way we can reduce the impact of winter ticks and get our moose healthy is to reduce the abundance or density of moose. We do that through hunting, and that gets us to our permit recommendation. Our recommendation this year is to issue 180 total moose hunting permits. 80 of those would be either sex permits, with 20 allotted to the archery season, 54 to the regular season, and 3 each for the auction and special opportunity permits, which have their choice of both season and WMU. The remaining 100 permits would be for antlerless moose only and all during the regular season. We expect this permit allocation to result in a total harvest of approximately 100 moose. And that breakdown of either sex and antlerless permits should result in a roughly equal harvest of bulls and cows. And that harvest would represent about 10% of the current population estimate of about 1,000 moose in WMU E. If we maintain that harvest each year and there are no changes in moose survival or birth rates, it would take about 7 years to reach the objective of 1 moose per square mile, or about 630 moose in E. So this proposal represents our concerted effort to achieve the objectives established in our 2020 to 2030 management plan by the end of that planning period. In a worst case scenario with very severe winter tick impacts each year, it would still take about 3 years to reduce the population to the objective level. And we are confident that that would give us enough time to make any necessary adjustments. Because in practice, we're going to come back each year with new information and adjust permit numbers accordingly to ensure we're on track to achieve our objective of a healthy and sustainable moose population. For more information on moose management in Vermont and the department's 2023 moose harvest recommendation, visit vtfishandwildlife.com.